documenting slave cabins. We are so grateful to people like you who attend our programs, support our work, and care about our historic places. We particularly want to thank our sponsors, Dominion Energy and TCV Trust and Wealth Management, for supporting our programs. Tonight's program is being recorded and it'll be on our website next week. We'll see what we can do about closed captioning on that too. I'm Danielle Porter, Director of Preservation Services at Historic Richmond. For those of you who do not know us, Historic Richmond is a nonprofit with a mission to shape the future of Richmond by preserving our distinctive historic character, sparking revitalization, and championing our past and future architectural legacy. In 2018, we adopted a set of preservation values, which have served as an important foundation for our advocacy work and preservation priorities. The first value is to celebrate everybody's history, to be accessible to all people, regardless of race, culture, and socioeconomic status, and to be more intentional about reaching historically underrepresented groups and histories. These values also go just beyond brick and mortar to be authentic and enhance relationships. Slave housing and the lives lived within them are a difficult and important part of our history to preserve. Slave housing was once one of the most common building types in our country, both in rural and urban settings. But because Black history has long been historically excluded from American history, most of these buildings no longer stand as part of our built environment. The limited number of buildings remaining make it all that more important that we document them so that our history is not lost forever. After visiting Brookberry Farm last summer, an antebellum plantation in South Richmond, I spent a lot of time thinking about the slave houses that remained there. You may remember that we did a lecture last summer on researching and documenting historic houses, which focused on that property. I was wondering what other slave houses remain in and around Richmond. Can we find them? Do the owners even know that there are slave houses on their property? How do the slave houses in a rural setting compare to those in the urban setting? How and what can we still learn from them? Through Brookberry, I ended up in contact with tonight's panelists, each of whom are experts in their field and have spent their careers looking into these questions. So without further ado, it's my pleasure to introduce our panel. Okay. Elvatrice Belsches, and you can see her on the side. Elvatrice is the author of several entries for the African American National Biography, a collaborative publication of the Hutchins Center for African and African American Research at Harvard University and the Oxford University Press. In 2020, she was awarded a grant by the Virginia Humanities for the development of the script for her documentary on Virginia Randolph. She also served as an in-studio researcher in the art department led by Academy Award-winning production designer Rick Carter on Steven Spielberg's motion picture Lincoln. Jobie Hill. Jobie is a licensed preservation architect and slave house expert. Since 2011, her research and professional work has focused exclusively on the architecture of slavery. In 2012, she started an independent project titled Saving Slave Houses, with the primary goal to ensure that slave houses are not lost forever, but also to change the way that we think and learn from slave houses. Part of this project includes the Slave House Database. She has worked with the National Museum of African American History and Culture, TED Talk, Tribble, Google, the Historic American Building Survey, Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, the National Trust for Historic Preservation, C-SPAN, Montpelier, and Monticello. Douglas Sanford. Doug has 40 years experience in archaeology and historic preservation and over 20 years in the Department of Historic Preservation at the University of Mary Washington. His research includes the study of 18th and 19th century historic sites, plantations, and African American archaeology in the Chesapeake region, and the architecture of the enslaved African Americans in Virginia. Since 2010, he has served as the co-director of the Virginia Slave Housing Project, a research endeavor focusing on the documentation, interpretation, and preservation of slave-related buildings. That's our panel. If we were in person, I would say let's all give them a warm welcome, but we're just on Zoom. So just before I pass it over to Elva, I wanted to start with a polling question for everyone. So let's see. Have you ever been inside a slave house? And I will give us maybe 30 seconds to answer this. Okay, so it looks like about 75% of you have said, oh, maybe a little bit more, have said that you've been inside a slave house. Let's see. I think I can share those results. Can everyone see them? Can the panelists see them? Cool. Okay, so that was just a little bit of fun to get you involved, but now I'm going to pass this off to Elva. Elva, you now have control of the screen, and Elva is going to give the general history and background of free and enslaved Blacks in Virginia during the antebellum period and how they lived. So Elva, please take it away.
All right, thank you. All right, I've been tasked to provide an overview for the next approximately 15 minutes on the experiences of free and enslaved Blacks. I'm going to try and concentrate on Central Virginia from about 1820 until 1865. All right, this is what we will cover fairly quickly. We will again provide an overview of the experiences of the enslaved in urban areas versus rural settings, a little bit about the domestic slave trade in Central Virginia, the free Black experience, and also the role of industrialization. And lastly, with the last 3 slides, we'll take a look at making the walls talk with a very special story involving a very special family. All right, my journey into chronicling the period of enslavement. And growing up as a kid, my father would take me down to elders who were related to us in North Carolina. My maternal and paternal sides hail from northeastern North Carolina. And he would always ask the elders whether or not they had any stories regarding slavery. So I got into this fairly early. And so moving ahead and tracing my roots as I got older, or our roots rather, I wanted to do or film a short documentary on some of the ancestors. And it was then that someone opened up their property to me so I could do a little filming in northeastern North Carolina. So what you are seeing here is the back of a slave duplex, if you will. It was separated by a chimney in the middle and you had 2 separate doors. I'm showing just the back of it for privacy's sake. This was in 1999. I was blessed to be on a property that had several outbuildings that dated back to the period of enslavement. And once I stepped up into that building, everyone, along with the videographer and the assistant, there were planks for the most part, and there were shards of old newspaper, which was meant in past years to prevent drafts. In looking at some of those shards of newspaper, I could clearly see one that dated back to the 1870s. So that was a pretty profound moment. Now, people lived in this particular cabin, as I understand it, at least until the 1930s with, tenants and that kind of thing. All right, in mentioning the domestic slave trade in Virginia, and particularly Richmond, it was huge. And I'm using this particular group of sales from the Richmond Inquirer just to give you an idea of how massive it was. And this really doesn't tell you how massive it was, but what we can see is this, from Dickinson and Hill, who were huge. They are asking for 50 Negroes. You got Betson Gregory for 20. Hector Davis, who was major as a slave trader, 50 Negroes. Pulliam, it was later Pulliam and Betts, and Davis and Dupree. This just speaks just to a small amount of the massive trade from Richmond. And there are reasons why Richmond at one point reportedly became second only to New Orleans as it relates to that domestic slave trade. For one, after the cessation of the international slave trade, if you will, you start to see the valuation of human beings actually going up. And you couple that with the expansion of the Southeast and the sugar plantations, and you start to see people who were auctioned off perhaps, and we're talking about young men here for an example, for $300 in about 1820. You start to see them in the 1840s and 50s going for $1,400, $1,500 if they were healthy. Some of the biggest ads that I've seen actually ask for 300 and 200 men, and you're likely to see that for railroad projects. All right, this allows us to speak a little bit about the effects of industrialization on the Black experience, because we're still talking about free Blacks and enslaved Blacks. Richmond is said to have been one of the most industrialized cities in the South, and I'm going to focus on three major industries. To the left, everyone, you're going to see a photo of the Tredegar Iron Works. It was one of the largest foundries in the entire South. It really had a growth spurt, if you will, when Joseph R. Anderson took control of it in the 1840s. Keep in mind, with these industries, they not only hired free people and enslaved people, they also owned their own slaves as a part of that particular industry. To the right, everyone, you'll see part of the hacksaw mills circa 1865. And LOC is just an acronym for the Library of Congress. Richmond is said to have had two of the largest flour mills in the entire country. It Hacksaw, the Gallego, Dunlap, Crenshaw, and several others. They actually exported their wares to Europe and even South America. And so again, you're having people, and enslaved people who were perhaps enslaved in rural areas being brought in and hired out, if you will. In addition to some free, you had artisans, and we'll talk about the third major industry a little bit later. Of course, that involved the many tobacco factories. All right, we hear a lot about enslavement and the massive slave trade from Central Virginia, but I want to provide an overview of the free Black experience in just a few numbers. In 1860, everyone, we had roughly 1.6 million citizens in Virginia, and about 480,000 enslaved people, and about 50,000 or so free Blacks. People were able to obtain freedom through numerous means, wills, through purchase, and we'll talk about some other ways. But keep in mind, this group of men and women, at least for Richmond and Petersburg, I can safely say, became leaders post-Civil War. Many of them did. Some of them acted as conduits, as you'll see at the bottom, to help others be manumitted or freed, if you will. In Richmond, I want to mention just some of the free Black neighborhoods. You had enclaves in and around the Chaco Creek area. At one point, you had an area near what was called Shed Town, but moreover, you had quite a few blacks, free blacks living in what was called Duval's Addition. Now, part of that area would become Jackson Ward. And I need to say a little bit about that because it's very important. Jackson Ward is a historic district associated with African American history and culture. As a matter of fact, today, historic Jackson Ward is said to be the largest National Historic Landmark District associated with African American history and culture, according to the Department of the Interior. So it came about and it was actually chartered in 1871. And that wasn't by happenstance, because after the passage of that 15th Amendment granting Black men the right to vote, this district came into being as a major gerrymandered district in order to corral as many Blacks as possible into one district. And it went all the way down to 18th Street. But if you look at the 1850s census directories, you'll find that many of the Black people who resided there resided in that area prior to the creation of the district. And so it was gerrymandered essentially with surgical precision. We cannot underestimate the importance of the Black worship experience as it relates to the experience of free Blacks and enslaved Blacks. As a matter of fact, some of the enslaved people who were hired had to find their own room and board, and they did so oftentimes with free Blacks. So free Blacks and enslaved Blacks worshiped together in several of the churches that were founded prior to the end of the Civil War. As a matter of fact, we had the first African Baptist church starting things off in 1841 with its split from the integrated church, if you will. We had Second African, which became Second Baptist in 1846, and Ebenezer Baptist Church in 1858. That church has the distinction of being in its same edifice. And so again, we cannot underestimate the importance of the worship experience, because this provided an opportunity to mingle and actually to acquire an education in many instances. And again, we have powerful examples of free Blacks who acted as conduits to freedom for not only kinfolks, if you will, but also others. One of the biggest examples that I can think of was a lady, a tremendous and incredible lady in Petersburg. She was known as Jinsey Snow prior to being freed. She was actually a nurse Black nurse, who was granted her freedom because of the extraordinary contribution she made to taking care of the sick. And she would later be known as Jane Minor, and it's duly stated, and we can verify these with primary documents, our audience, that she participated in acting as a conduit to freedom for at least 16 people. And this lady even had her own private hospital. So these are powerful stories that help us to amplify and actually expand on the narratives. All right, slavery-related housing in Virginia. I say slavery-related because it may not be a slave house or a slave dwelling, but enslaved people may have resided there. So again, we've already mentioned the fact that free Blacks did act as landlords at times for the enslaved. And some of those major industries that we just covered with the massive flour mills and the Tredegar Iron Works, and we'll look at some of the major tobacco factories towards the end. Many of these had their own barracks-like housing, if you will, okay? And lastly, we're gonna take a look at some extant buildings and slave dwellings that are within the city of Richmond. People often think about the dwellings that they've seen in rural areas, but in our midst, we still have some buildings. You have to know what you're looking for, and then you must cross-reference what you think you know with hardcore evidence, and doing some digging in regards to the owners, and also looking at when the house or the home was created. And we have magnificent repositories here, like the Department of Historic Resources and also the Library of Virginia, who are really great, have excellent records for those kinds of things. All right, I want to show you, and this is within the city of Richmond, and it is, there are more of these than you know, but this is within the portion of Richmond known as Church Hill. And what we're looking at is a kitchen dependency with servants' quarters. That is how it is described. So if you're looking at records and you hope to see always, well, that was a slave quarter. Well, that isn't how it works. Oftentimes you will see other names, dependencies, servants' quarters, quarters. But this is a prime example of an attached kitchen with servants' quarters. One door leads to the kitchen, by the way, what we're looking at now, and the others are led right into the quarters. This picture was probably taken circa 1985, but it is still standing and looks just like this. Now, this is in Church Hill. This is courtesy of Waite Rawls. All right, everyone, this is actually a dwelling in the historic Jackson Ward that I just mentioned. Again, this was a district that had quite a few free Blacks prior to the creation of the ward officially in 1871. This house, this property does date back to the early 1850s. And what I did was I looked up the owner's personal property taxes, and sure enough, he was listed as having 6 people or owning 6 slaves, as it was stated, who had already reached the age of 12 or more. So I was able to cross-check and cross-reference, because what you think is perhaps was a former slave quarter may not always have been that. So you've got to cross-reference, and you can't assume anything. But again, this is one in actually historic Jackson Ward that is up and extant today. All right, now this particular photograph, everyone, allows us to look at the major industry that we hadn't mentioned, and that's the tobacco industry or tobacco factories. I believe by circa 1850, Richmond had at least or approximately 50 tobacco factories. And this one belonged to William Turpin and Mr. Yarborough. Now, I'm sorry, Miles Turpin and William Yarborough. It was built in 1853, and they owned over 100 enslaved people at one point. So there were some enslaved people who were housed at this building. This building still stands, and it is now the Polick Brothers Box Factory Apartments. So this is near 25th and Franklin Street, and this was taken courtesy of the LOC by HABS, the Historic American Buildings and Survey. But there's a special story as I round up and end my part of this that is attached to this building. It allows us to speak to the Brooks family. Audience, Albert Royal Brooks was a hack owner in Richmond, Virginia. Now, hacks were akin to taxis or Ubers, but although this man was enslaved, he was born in about 1817 or so. He had his own snack shop, and he had his own hack service. He actually had men working for him. Now, he had a wife and several children, but his master was separate from his wife's master. And so I believe when his wife's master passed away in circa 1858 or so, he and his wife looked for local buyers for their kids so they wouldn't be sent south. They were successful in finding local buyers, but one buyer reneged, and the daughter was sold away and she eventually passed. However, Mr. Brooks found a buyer by the name of Daniel von Groening. He was a German consul who purchased his wife and 3 of the younger kids for $800. And I believe Mr. Brooks made payments for over 4 years, about 4 years to keep them together. Mrs. Lucy Good Brooks, his wife, and some of the 3 of the younger kids. Now, the son Walter Henderson Brooks and his brother David, they were little kids at this time, were sold to this particular Turpin and Yarborough factory, if you will. And one of the, I think, gut-wrenching narratives I think I've seen, it was recorded by Mr. Walter Henderson Brooks, who was little at that time. He said, and I'm paraphrasing, you know, it was all my little hands could do to keep up with that work. And I was mortified as to what would happen if I didn't. Well, by the grace of God, by around 1862, because of the war, they were able, Yarborough and Turpin, I should say Turpin and Yarborough, started to hire out and sell people. And Lucy Good Brooks was able to, by this time, since she was free, actually purchase her sons back and hire them out herself. That is a powerful story. It's a powerful story of faith and perseverance. Next, with that little kid, keep in mind Walter Henderson Brooks. Mr. Brooks would go on to graduate from Lincoln University, Pennsylvania, become a pastor, and actually at Second Baptist Church in Richmond, Virginia. Ironically, he would work as a post office clerk under Elizabeth Van Lew, the noted spy. She was given the position as postmistress by President Grant. I believe she served from about 1869 until 1877. But moreover, Mr. Brooks would become nationally known as an orator, as a historian of the Baptist Church in particular. He was a poet, but this gentleman actually pastored the 19th Street Baptist Church in Washington, D.C. for 63 years. And as I understand it, in some of his sermons, he would hearken back to that very dark day when he saw the older sister that the parents could not save, cried off at auction on the auction block. So that in itself is a powerful story of the Brookses. But the legacy of excellence continues, and this is my last slide, everyone. It continues with Dr. Walter Henderson Brooks's granddaughter, Dr. Evelyn Brooks Higginbotham. Dr. Higginbotham is the Victor S. Thomas Professor of History and African American Studies at Harvard University. And she is also the co-editor of African American Lives and the African American National Biography, along with Dr. Henry Louis Gates. And so you can just see the perseverance and the power of education just come down through the ages, but it is a powerful story of faith and hope and resilience. And this is where my part starts. I will not exceed my 15 minutes. Thank you so much for your patience.
Thank you, Elva. All right, so this house that you're looking at is a 2-story dependency behind the Hardgrove House in Churchill, and is one of the best preserved slave houses in the city. It contains a kitchen with an antique oven still in place, and John Jasper, who is remembered for his preaching career, was actually enslaved by the Hardgroves and would have been at this property at some point in time. So my question for you, hang on, oops. Okay. Is, what would you call this slave building? Cabin, dwelling, house, or quarters? And again, I'll give you, I don't know, 15 seconds to do this. And All right, so let me share those results. So no one said cabin, 20% said dwelling, 25% said dwelling, 7% said house, and 69% said quarters. So I was hoping that all three panelists could come off mute and just, in 1 minute or less, just talk about what the difference is between these terms and why you might use one or not the other. And there isn't really totally a whole right or wrong answer, but if the panelists could please just talk about this for a moment.
I'll chime in first. I think you need to have the ability to utilize several terms because, for an example, where you have barracks-like housing, it's going to be totally different from a slave cabin. So I think for me personally, there will always be a need for multiple terms. That's my thought on it.
I'm happy to go next, and it's why I prefer the general term housing, because that to me is all inclusive, includes such things as cabins and quarters. I would call this the combination of kitchen quarters, or you'll see during my talk, I can refer to it as a mixed use building. And these were very common arrangements where you had slave housing within a building that has other functions. Whereas in the period, cabin usually referred to, I think the audience caught on to this, the cabin usually refers to a small, less substantial building, often just one room with maybe a loft above. And whereas quarters is, in the time period, 18th, 19th century, can mean multiple things. It can mean a single building, multiple buildings. It can mean a distinct part of a plantation that has slave quarters on it, maybe overseers' houses, agriculture buildings. And it can just mean domestic spaces in general, quartering rooms.
Yeah, so I can go next. Yeah, so I use similar naming conventions as Doug does. So I call the kitchen quarter also, which reflects its use, which is, a workspace and a living space, in this case as a kitchen. But when it comes to kind of dwelling, cabin, or a house, so I spent a lot of time thinking about this. And for me, dwelling is too generic. Like a home is too personal for enslaved people, but I like house because it's kind of in between. So enslaved people weren't able to control everything about where they lived, but they were able to control some of the details. And so that's why I prefer house, because it's, like I said, it's somewhere in between. And they did turn these, they were able to make these structures into a home for themselves, even though it was always a temporary space. And like I said, they couldn't control everything about it, but they were able to turn it into a sacred space for themselves and their family. So that's how I kind of distinguish between all the different terms.
Okay, thank you. And Jobie, I am actually going to pass the control to you right now so that you can talk about how you research. Oops, sorry, one more. There we go. There you go.
Okay, all right. So we'll get started. Let's see if it will. Use the keys. Hold on. There's a little bit of a delay. There we go. Okay. So I'm a licensed preservation architect with a background in archaeology and anthropology. My personal mission is to advance an evidence-based understanding and acknowledgement of the institution of slavery in America. A cornerstone of this effort is the belief that the histories of many non-white Americans have been told to them and not by them. To that end, I am dedicated to the interpretation and preservation of living and working environments of enslaved people, integrated with their own oral histories and historical records related to the business of slavery. My professional work to date has been the documentation, preservation, and interpretation of slave houses. I started an independent project titled Saving Slave Houses to ensure that slave houses were not lost forever. One of the most important components of Saving Slave Houses project is the Slave House database. The Slave House database represents a comprehensive national architectural and anthropological study of slave houses in the United States. It is designed to be a resource for descendants, researchers, museums, organizations, and the public to study and interpret the surviving evidence of slavery, and to serve as a way to preserve and study the important but largely lost slave house. For my research purposes, a slave house includes all enslaved spaces in which housing was one of the functions. It was very common for enslaved people to work and live in the same building. This is especially true of kitchens and wash houses, because these services were always in high demand. The Slave House database has two parts: documentation and interpretation. The documentation is a visual representation of the spaces, and the interpretations are descriptions of the spaces from the actual inhabitants who lived and worked there during slavery. The architectural drawings and images of slave houses represent snapshots in time. In this context, slave houses are considered artifacts, and like all artifacts, they can convey important messages about their makers, occupants, and uses. The most direct way of getting at an accurate interpretation of the uses, activities, and feelings associated with historic slave houses is through accounts left by formerly enslaved people themselves. The narratives recorded from formerly enslaved people breathe life into the two-dimensional drawings and photographs of slave houses. My research involves examining both the historical record and material culture. I've completed over 700 architectural and anthropological surveys of enslaved spaces in the US. In addition to fieldwork, I've conducted extensive research and detailed analysis of the materials of the largest collections of documented slavery architecture in America. They are interviews collected by historically Black colleges and universities in the late 1920s, the slave narratives collected in the 1930s, the architectural surveys completed by the Historic American Buildings Survey since 1933, the Virginia Historical Inventory Project in 1937, and the research and documentation carried out by the Architectural Research Department at the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation since 1980. Having seen firsthand hundreds of slave houses, as well as studying them from an interdisciplinary perspective, I'm able to offer an exclusive perspective about the structures and the inhabitants of slave houses. The Historic American Buildings Survey, or HABS, was a government program established in 1933 for relief employment under the Works Progress Administration, or WPA. HABS was able to employ 1,000 qualified architects and draftsmen to record historically significant buildings of the United States. The purpose of the survey was to obtain a complete record of the architectural features of the buildings. Photographs were intended to supplement the measured drawings and not to serve as the only form of documentation. But for 60% of the slave house sites, a photograph turned out to be the only type of documentation. Only 14% of the HABS documented slave houses have both a measured drawing and a photograph. Extensive research on slavery has been conducted by the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation, or CWF, over the decades. Since 1980, the Architectural Research Department has been actively conducting architectural surveys and historical research of enslaved spaces as part of the Agricultural Buildings Project, making it one of the largest collections of documented slave houses. I was awarded the Fellowship in African and African American History and Culture from the Colonial Williamsburg Foundation for 4 years in a row. For my fellowships, I worked with the architectural historians to digitize the entire Agricultural Buildings Project collection. I scanned over 5,000 measured drawings, field notes, photographs, and written reports. CWF has surveyed over 700 US sites. Of these, 200 sites have an enslaved building. The interpretation portion of the database includes descriptions of the slave house and the activities that took place there from the actual enslaved people living there during slavery. The largest and most widely known collection of narratives is the Federal Writers Slave Narratives Project. The Federal Writers Project, a WPA program, was established in 1935 and was designed to provide jobs for unemployed historians and writers. One of the assignments for the Writers Project was to collect American life histories from people of all backgrounds. One type of narrative that was of great interest to John Lomax, the director of the Writers Project, was the interviews with formerly enslaved people. In 1937, the official Slave Narratives Project was created. At the end of the project, more than 2,300 first-person accounts of slavery and 500 black and white photographs of people once enslaved in the US have been collected by the Writers Project from 17 states. Black scholars have always been at the forefront of collecting and telling African-American history in the United States. Even though their work often goes unrecognized for decades or longer, without them, some of the greatest scholarly work would not have ever come into fruition, such as the Federal Writers Slave Narrative Project. One of the leaders in the systematic collection of oral histories from formerly enslaved people was John Cade. While working at Southern University and then Prairie View State College, Cade conducted around 500 interviews in more than 17 states. Just recently, a collection of narratives at Southern University became available online. The collection contains 229 narratives from 17 states. Of these 229 narratives, 121 describe their house during slavery. This slide shows you an example of just kind of what some of the results of the two collections look like. And on the next couple of slides is examples of some of the responses given by each of the two interviews. And I'm just going to have you read them on your own. But as you're reading them, kind of get an idea of how they chose to try to record the dialect, and also what it's kind of like to work with each of the collections. But as you'll see from the responses, the WPA questions tended to invoke responses that describe the building, while the CADE questions tended to get responses that were more emotional. So the next couple slides, just read on your own. Slavery was different for every single person who experienced it, free, freed, or enslaved. There are broad patterns and similarities between daily life of the enslaved from one site to the next. But in order to truly begin to understand the human dimensions associated with slave houses, one must carefully consider the descriptions given by someone who actually lived and worked in these buildings. Narratives from formerly enslaved people provide insight into the uses, activities, and feelings associated with the historic slave house. Details that fuse a voice about the human condition with the physical structure. The anthropological history, in combination with the preservation of the historic slave house, reveals a part of history that cannot be gleaned from the historical record alone. My methodology, which I call In Their Own Words, is able to identify the ex-slave narratives that describe a specific documented slave house. In this context, the house where the person lived during slavery is the same house that is featured in the image. Of the 485 HAB sites with a documented slave house, and the 1,010 Writers Project narratives that describe the house during slavery, only 5 documented slave houses from the HABS collection can be directly linked to an ex-slave narrative recorded by the Writers Project. My favorite example of the 5 match sites is the Taylor Plantation in Alabama. It is a rare HAB site that can be matched to the ex-slave narrative of Jane Holloway. This site and Jane's interview provide insight into the lives of enslaved people on a small plantation. During slavery, Jane lived with her mother, Carrie, her father, Taylor, and her brother, Marilyn. Jane and her family lived in a one-room log house. She remembers that the room itself was not very big, but the fireplace was. Recalling the large fireplace made Jane think of spending time with her family, the meals they ate together, and how precious these times were while she was growing up. The Slave House database also includes new, current, documentation for each of the slave houses. This documentation represents survey work that I have completed and will continue to do. To date, I have completed surveys of approximately 700 buildings at over 150 sites across 7 states and have driven over 9,000 miles. The HABS collection has been the primary focus of my research thus far. Therefore, it will be the first collection that I complete survey work for. This phase of the survey work involved locating and resurveying the HABS documented slave houses in the United States. I should note that when I am in an area, I survey as many sites as I can get to, not just the HABS sites. The goals for my survey work are to 1, identify which of the HABS documented slave houses still exist. 2, to document the current conditions of the surviving structures. 3, to record architectural information that is missing from the original survey and record any additional buildings that were not documented during the original survey. And 4, to collect GIS coordinates for each structure. For myself, fieldwork provides a perspective that can only be gained from personally interacting with and experiencing a space. There's no substitute for standing in a slave house and experiencing the overwhelming rush of emotions that comes with it. Having a physical space to experience and interact with is one of the best ways to help people grapple with some of the complexities and harsh conditions that slavery imposed. Unfortunately, many people won't have the opportunity to experience this in person. 66% of the sites I've surveyed are privately owned. 27% of the structures have been demolished, and another 5% have been abandoned, so soon they too will disappear from the landscape. But with the use of technology and continued determination, the story doesn't have to end here. Technology not only plays an important role in the documentation process, but also in the storytelling process. I use technology to explore the intersection between the built environment, history, humanities, community, and storytelling, with the goal of yielding captivating educational digital humanities projects. Appreciating the landscape of slavery through the perspective of the enslaved community takes time and patience and practice and must be done on a holistic level. This means approaching it with an open mind and a willingness to let go of preconceived ideas and beliefs about the people who built and lived in these structures. It also requires the ability to accept grim and sometimes vile truths. True insight about what life was like for enslaved people can only be gained by examining how and why enslaved people made decisions, and above all, accepting their mechanisms to survive oppression. For example, history's definition of a slave owner is a person who owned or enslaved another human being. But to an enslaved person, the slave owner was also a slave breeder and trader. If a slave owner at any time forced an enslaved person to reproduce, or if a slave owner profited from an enslaved female having a child, then he was a slave breeder. And if a slave owner at any time sold or bought an enslaved person, then he was a slave trader. He didn't have to be breeding or trading enslaved people by the hundreds to bear this title. Committing this moral crime only once earned you this label. Slave owners were not shy about expressing their interest in and belief that they had the right to control the reproductive rights and schedules of enslaved women. At Monticello in Charlottesville, Virginia, Thomas Jefferson wrote, "I consider a woman who brings a child every 2 years as more profitable than the best man on the farm. What she produces is an addition to the capital, while his labors disappear in mere consumption." At Green Hill Plantation in Campbell County, Virginia, Samuel Pennell was so proud of his slave breeding and trading activities that he built a stone slave auction block and auctioneer stand right outside his front door. It is these historical accounts and the psychological trauma they inflicted on enslaved people that we must remember when interpreting the landscape of slavery in slave houses. We must also remember and learn to recognize that for each action made by the slave owner in an attempt to control, there were counteractions of resistance made by the enslaved. Enslaved people were given inadequate resources with which to build their dwellings. This was a way for slave owners to assert dominance and dehumanize the enslaved community. Close examination of extant slave houses reveal that enslaved carpenters knew how to build their houses so that aesthetically they were within the accepted social hierarchies of slavery, but at the same time they were inconspicuously constructed with the finest craftsmanship to ensure that their legacies would live on. Enslaved builders incorporated survival mechanisms into the architecture, discreetly showed off their unrivaled carpentry skills, and left behind personal signatures. Lately, my work has been focused on working with descendants. This summer, Saving Slave Houses and Virginia Humanities is hosting the inaugural Virginia Black Public History Institute. which has brought together a multi-generational group of slavery descendants with ancestral ties to 5 Virginia historical sites. The Descendant Workshop participants and interns are exploring public history through weekly readings, virtual roundtable discussions, hands-on learning, and engagement with professionals, policymakers, and government officials. The interns are also assisting with conducting research and working with the participants to complete collaborative research projects. The ultimate goal of this first-of-a-kind hybrid workshop is to promote equitable co-stewardship of Black ancestral sites statewide by equipping descendant communities with cutting-edge scholarship, tools, and other resources, and a national support network. This workshop is laying the foundation for what future partnerships between descendants, historic sites, and organizations should and can look like. It is also a pipeline for future collaborative Black public history projects. And that is the end. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Jobie. So up next is Doug, but before we move on to him, I just want to, Doug also has the Virginia Slave Housing project, and I wanted to talk about, should we have, how many repositories should we have for slave housing? I don't think there's an issue with having multiple ones, but do you two ever see yourselves, integrating into one database? Should there be multiple databases? How do you see this being housed? Doug or Jobie?
Okay, well, I'll go. I agree. I think there should be multiple databases. Again, there's, different people have different methods, purposes, goals, et cetera, different priorities, but obviously by being publicly available, to me, that's the key factor, that people can access this information and share it with one another. Obviously, I do think we should all be at least sending some of our information to the Virginia Department of Historic Resources as a professionally maintained archive. I think that's a valuable resource and one that's publicly available. It's going to be archived for the long range future in that way. And that's something that our project has talked with the Department of Historic Resources about, is making our information available to them.
Yeah, so I think I would like to see one repository, in the sense that when people are doing this research, when I first got started, I found a lot of little projects, but like all over the place. And it takes a really long time to find those, right? And figure out where they are. And so it'd be nice to have one place where all this could live, or at least you could access all these different projects and other databases. So that would be really useful and save people time of trying to find all these little ones that are hidden away. And it's a small world. Like, so Doug and I have worked together many times, we always run into each other when we're doing this work. And so we know how to find things and who to talk to, but when you're just getting started to do this, you're not going to know, all those kind of tricks and where to go. So it would be really nice to have something that is user friendly and can get people to the right spot. So people will be more interested in this and have an easier time doing this research and not get frustrated and stop.
Okay, thank you. So next, Doug, I'm going to pass control of the screen to you. There you go, and you can take it away.
Okay. Well, good evening, everyone, and thank you for having me. So I said my main objective here is to talk about the Virginia Slave Housing Project. And before I go on, I do want to point out that this has definitely been a team effort, and my long-term colleague in all of this is Dennis Pogue, most recently of the Department of Historic Preservation at the University of Maryland. Let's see here. Here we go. In terms of our goals and methods, one of the main one is to compile comparative information about slave housing from different sources. So previously surveyed buildings, archaeological sites, period documents like fire insurance policy. I'll show some examples of those. And then we also do field surveys to go and document standing and surviving buildings. We want to make this information publicly available, such as through our website and other presentations, and especially to encourage the public's awareness of slave housing's importance and its need for preservation. We obviously encourage property owners who have slave buildings to preserve those. I'll give some examples. And we also want to see, whether by us or others, is to use these buildings to discuss issues of American slavery and racism and African American heritage. I think it's obvious for us tonight why we study slave housing, but I think it's also worth it to go over a number of these reasons. This is a common, widespread form of American architecture. There were tens of thousands of these buildings just in Virginia. And so these were as common as any other type of American architecture and deserve the same study. These are buildings that obviously embody our country's history of slavery and tell the story of the Virginia component of the African diaspora. These are dynamic buildings. They represent both the enslaver and the enslaved. The enslaver often decided how big these buildings would be, what materials were used, the format, where they were placed on the land. But there is this constant negotiation and power struggle about these buildings. So yes, they were about attempted control and oppression, but they were also about African-American resilience and resistance. And this is where they made their domestic lives. Jobie referred to this. So these are places that supported Black families, Black communities, and African-American culture. So these four images give you examples of our different sources. So in the upper left is a fire insurance policy of 1803. In this case, describing a Negro quarter in Loudoun County, Virginia. This is from the Mutual Assurance Society of Virginia. And so besides these sketches, these policies will give you the basic materials of the walls and the roof and the dimensions of these buildings. The upper right image is an archaeological site, so we can obtain architectural information. In this case, this is a slave quarter along Mulberry Row at Monticello, a log building. To the lower left is a Habs photograph. And again, Jobie talked about these. Again, examples of buildings that have been, slave buildings that have been previously surveyed. And to the lower right is a log cabin in Stafford County, Virginia, which I'll talk about later. But this represents the role of the Virginia Slave Housing Project in going into the field and documenting these type of buildings. So I won't bore you with all these numbers, but I'll let you read through them. But these are indications of how many buildings are out there, and I mean that both in the past and in the present. So there are several hundred. There now are 400 or more previously surveyed buildings on file with the Virginia Department of Historic Resources. We've obtained information from archaeological sites. There are close to 300 slave-related buildings talked about in the fire insurance policies that I mentioned. And these are just simple counts of, quote, slave houses. But if you go to the 1860 US Census, there are thousands and thousands of slave buildings documented in those census records. To date, our project has looked at 104 buildings in the field from 32 counties and 5 cities. As you can see by the percentages, most of them are brick or frame construction. These are the ones that tend to survive better as compared to log buildings. Log cabins were the most common variety of slave housing. We know that from historic records, but they are some of the fewest to survive. In terms of our field methods, again, this is the goal of having comparative information, standardized information. So we do a very detailed standardized field form. We also take detailed field notes. You see there in the center an example of one of our drawings. So we do measurements for planned drawings, and then we take a standardized set of digital color photographs, both on the exterior and on the interior, and eventually put all of this information on our website. Trying to see, here we go. So in terms of our results, the type of buildings that we see, this term has come up before, duplexes or double quarters. This is a very common format, but I will also say it's one that survives better. These tend to be larger, better built structures closer to the plantation mansion house or manor house in the center of farm complexes. These were intentionally designed to house two enslaved households. So they often have two exterior doors, central chimneys. So along that central wall, you'd have a fireplace to either side. And so the two households were kept separate by those interior partitions, but obviously shared the same building. Many duplexes had central chimneys, but some had chimneys at the end. And as you can see here, they came in log, frame construction, also brick and stone. A couple other building types, again, ones that people, they know this name, cabin. These are, as I said, tend to be smaller, one-room structures, often with a loft above for storage and sleeping arrangements. So you see a log and a frame one here to your left. Whereas to the right are examples, we've hit on this earlier in the talks on kitchen quarters. So the example in the upper right is in Stafford County, and it had a kitchen and a laundry below, and then two rooms for enslaved households upstairs. Whereas the middle photograph and the lower right photograph are from the city of Fredericksburg. And there's, in this case, a kitchen below and a single room up above. So again, very, very typical types of buildings. That last example leads us to the topic of urban slave housing, which we've tried to give more attention to because rural slave housing, plantation housing has been studied the most, whereas especially as architectural historians and archaeologists, we are sort of late to coming to urban locations. I think, Danielle, you showed the upper left building earlier, but these two examples that you see here on the left are both from East Grace Street in Churchill, and again are examples of kitchen and workspace below, and then two rooms for enslaved peoples up above. And you'll notice in both cases, they would have accessed those rooms through separate exterior stairs. So had their own access to those rooms above. But I do want to emphasize the great variety of slave housing that existed in urban areas, including, this also happened in rural areas, that some of the enslaved resided with their owners or employers in the house, so in a garret, in an attic, in a basement. So why we use that term slave housing. So in using those fire insurance policies I mentioned earlier, we see how common what I call mixed use buildings were. So that's where slave housing is combined with some other buildings. Kitchens are the most common example we see of this. But if you look at that list below, stables and carriage houses had slave housing, laundries, wash houses, offices. Elva, you mentioned factories and warehouses. So there are a wide variety of combinations. And if you look at this example on the left, in Petersburg from 1826, this is a kitchen, and they called it servants' lodging, but this is about slave housing. In this case, the word lodging is meaningful. It's about a rental arrangement. We know that, for instance, hired out slaves often ended up renting lodging. So whether a room like this above a kitchen or in boarding houses or other places in Virginia's towns and cities. Overall, from a preservation standpoint, as I said, it's a mixture of good news and bad news. On the great side, there are many more buildings out there than we thought initially. It's a matter of looking for them. It's also a matter of talking to local people who know these buildings the best and getting access to them. So many more buildings than we thought. On the negative side, many are in poor condition and are about to go. So the two buildings that you see images here, we recorded these during our project, and these are both gone. And other examples are close to going. So there's a whole variety of threats to slave housing. If these buildings are neglected and let go, they just naturally deteriorate, and plants and animals move in and take over. Obviously, at times there's purposeful destruction, or these buildings go in the way of development. When I say competing and alternative uses, an example of that is many cases, people who have these buildings will convert them to a modern use and completely remodel the interior. So it's not intentional destruction, but we end up losing lots of historic fabric, finishes, evidence, etc. Here's some examples of preservation successes. So the two images in the upper left are of a log duplex in Fauquier County on a property called Weston. And I'm very proud to say that the Warrenton Antiquarian Society, their primary mission was associated with the main house and its agricultural complex on one part of the property, but they willingly changed their focus and took a strong interest in this building. They engaged in a sensitive rehabilitation of the duplex and now are publicly interpreting both slavery for this building, but also its history of Black tenants in the post-Civil War period. They've connected with the descendant community associated with Weston and have done oral history, including done oral history with an African-American woman who was born in this building. The lower example is a log cabin in Stafford County that I've shown you earlier. It has obvious structural problems. Again, happy to say that the Stafford County local government there has decided to invest in this building. They stabilized it earlier, and as we speak, are going to engage in a restoration of the building. And I don't know this for sure, but my best guess is this is the last surviving slave log cabin in Stafford County. Danielle asked me to speak a little bit about archaeology as well, which I think is a very valuable tool, as I say here, to connect directly with enslaved African Americans. So for instance, through archaeology, we can determine building plans and what the immediate yards and landscape features were around these buildings, including the gardens that enslaved people had. And I bring this up because, for example, there are no surviving standing slave quarters from the 17th century. So we only can get to these types of buildings through archaeology. So the two images in the upper right show you a type of architecture known as earth-fast or post-in-the-ground architecture. This was based on vertical posts, vertical timbers in the ground. So you see that sort of rectangular outline of post holes there. So these were very common type of buildings in the 17th and 18th century, and none are still standing today. We have very few slave buildings from the 18th century. So we really, archaeology is a way to get to this sort of missing component. Obviously, I think a great attraction of archaeology is to see the artifacts that represent the personal possessions, the ways of life of enslaved African Americans, but also their means of resistance, their cultural resiliency. So for instance, the artifacts that you see here are from Mulberry Row at Monticello, and none of these materials, none of these objects were provided by Thomas Jefferson. Slaves either made these objects themselves or found ways, one way or another, to obtain them. So whether it's bone combs or brushes, coins, a cowrie shell, etc. So as I said, archaeology is a way to engage in a diverse range of topics. So seeing the survival of African traditions, how those traditions often creolized into becoming African-American cultural practices. So whether you want to talk about religion or art, foodways, etc. The ceramic container you see in the upper right, this is a ceramic known as colonoware. And this type of ceramic, this type of earthenware was made by the enslaved, both for their own purposes, but for instance, they sold it to their enslavers. They sold it to other people as well. So again, we know from historic documents the type of goods, the food rations that owners tended to provide the enslaved. But when we look archaeologically, we see a whole range of goods that were either self-produced, stolen in some cases, traded or bartered for, but also purchased. We know slaves had access to money and acted as consumers in this case. And we don't have time for it this evening, but there's the whole internal economy that was based amongst the enslaved. So whether on plantations or in rural areas or in Virginia cities, historians have long been aware of this, but brings out this active component, this type of agency by the enslaved. And so again, I won't go through this list, but I really do want to acknowledge and thank all the people who have worked with us, who have supported us. So whether individuals, students, organizations, the Virginia Humanities, for example, I will say we have had tremendous cooperation from property owners. It's been quite rare that we've ever been refused access to these buildings, which has really been wonderful. At the bottom of the slide is our website. It's a long, complex address, but there it is. And if you go to the architecture school at the University of Maryland website and look for the Virginia Slave Housing Project, you'll find it there. So thank you very much.
Thank you, Doug. So the next question for our poll is, if you know of any buildings or former building sites related to the enslaved in your area, and not trying to be subtle, but if you know of something that we can go out and document, could you please put it in the chat or send me an email at dporter@historicrichmond.com, and we would love to see if it's been documented, and if not, go out and try to document it. I see 11 people say that they 12 know of buildings or sites. So if you could please find a way through the chat feature right now, you can just write in your email address and I can reach out to you, or if you know the name or address or anything, we're just trying to gather whatever we can. I see 19 yeses, okay? So, and then my next question in a similar vein is that we are currently working on a survey with the Department of Historic Resources and the City of Richmond called the Southside Richmond Selective Architectural Survey, where we are looking for unrecorded resources in the 1970 and 1942 annexed areas that are south of the James River. We're looking for, so unrecorded resources, potential historic districts, resources within flood zones, and resources associated with minority communities. On Tuesday, August 17th at 6 p.m., DHR is hosting a virtual public information session on this. And we, Historic Richmond, in one of our newsletter blasts, will be sending more information about this. So similarly, if you have any resources in Richmond, whether they're related to the enslaved or just a building down your road that you think there's some really cool history to, you know, a band that got famous later on was hanging out there, or something happened in that house that you might not know from just walking down the road that it's significant, or maybe we actually just can't see it when we're walking down the road, so there's no way for us to know that resource is there. I am just asking you to, again, please let us know. So that is the end of our program, but I saved some time for question and answer. So let me see what we got. Okay. Thousands of enslaved people lived in cities and towns, not on farms or plantations. Many of those people were skilled laborers. Why has there been so little research done on where and how those urban enslaved people lived? And anyone on the panel can answer this.
Well, I'll take a stab at it. Part of this course has been architectural historians in the past, architects have focused on the architecture of the rich, the powerful, the white, the wealthy, etc. So these buildings have been neglected. Also, many of them in urban areas, we would call them outbuildings or back buildings. And again, most architectural surveys tend to just look at the house on the street as compared to what's behind it in the backyard. And so in that sense, there's a lot of survey work left to do. There's a lot of areas that just have not been closely examined.
Jobie.
also,
Oh,
I'd
sorry.
also say, yeah, it's, in a sense, I agree with everything Doug said. It's also a little harder to tell the story of slavery with those sites because people understand like the big plantations and, you know, how those kind of operated, and the story of kind of urban slavery is harder for, I think, people kind of grasp, right? In a sense that it is very complicated, right? And how that worked and how enslaved people were moving around and getting around and where they were living and, you know, who they were living with when they were working there. And yeah, it gets more complicated. And so I think people kind of shied away from doing kind of that research and telling that story, honestly.
All right, Jobie, I've got one that's specifically to you. As a
Okay.
Civil War historian, I've learned not to trust memoirs because the writer would recount what he wanted, not what happened. The slave narrative simply must have the similar bias. How do you, as a historian, discount what you read to try to get to the truth?
Yes, so there are definitely things about the slave narratives that you have to be careful with, like with all memoirs, but in reality, all of history that is written down is someone's memory, right? Like, I mean, it's all of it is. So just because it's written down, we've been taught that because, you know, that is written down, that is correct. And it's a book that's published means it's correct. But that's not necessarily true, right? So with the slave narratives, because of, especially the WPA narratives, because of the way they were kind of like working, and they had a questionnaire that they were working from, that questionnaire survives. So you know exactly what questions they were asking. And so you can see, when you're working with the question, you can see how they kind of what exact question they were answering, and you can tell some of them very obviously if it was like honest kind of answer, or if it wasn't. But some of them it is trickier. So just like with everything else, you just have to try to. You just can't take it afterward. You have to, you know, back it up with other research. And there are some questions that are, I say, for example, because I'm working with kind of houses that there wouldn't really be a reason for them to kind of be making stuff up. You know, if they're asking, you know, what type of, you know, what was your house, the materials that your house was built from, you know, something like that. There's not really any reason why they would be lying. But for questions like, you know, how were you treated? You know, was your slave owner nice? Like one of the questions from the WPA was your overseer poor white trash? You know, that one, you know, probably not one that you should really, you know, just take on face value for the answers. But so.
Thank you. Elva, can you explain further about what evidence there is that enslaved workers were housed in the Turpin and Yarborough tobacco factory building specifically, as opposed to somewhere else off-site?
Yes, I'd be happy to. Two different sources. I didn't mention that between 1861 and 1863, part of the Turpin and Yarborough factory was used as the second Alabama Confederate Hospital. So we have records from the National Archives with the record group 109. So, you know, every time the matron had to order food or supplies, or if she put out notices to hire Black cooks, Black laundresses, or hire them, or purchase them, if you will. Those things can be found in that record group. And moreover, even in the newspapers, it lists that there were some on-site rooms. That's one example of how we can document that. And we can even talk about the history of Blacks in nursing with speaking about things like that. But moreover, getting back to Mr. Walter Henderson Brooks, when his mother became freed in roughly 1862, and Turpin and Yarborough, like other industry bigwigs, if you will, were they needed, if you will, to hire out people to make ends meet. And also they sold some of their people. It is there that Walter Brooks recounts that he was able to move back with his mother. So that shows you that he was separated from her. And that's another anecdotal way, but I'm sure there are myriad other examples too. But we know of these things from the record groups because it was utilized, one, as the second Alabama Confederate hospital for a time, and also with Walter Henderson Brooks as a child getting to move back with his mom, because after she obtained her freedom, she was able to hire out her own two sons, Walter, and I believe the other son from Yarborough and Turpin was little David.
Thank you.
Mm-hmm.
All right, let's see. Have you found any instances of death due to fires in the kitchen attached to where enslaved people lived?
Is that for me?
Anyone?
Oh,
Anyone
okay.
in your research?
I have not.
I'm sure kitchen fires were pretty common.
Oh,
I mean,
yeah.
because when you think about the chimneys for some of these slave-related dwellings, they were meant to be pushed off, literally. Okay, so I'm sure that's fairly common because these things happen even today. So, I mean, back then, you know, you've got mud and sticks and bricks. Absolutely, I'm sure that happened. We know that that happened from time to time.
Yes, I've not found anything. I don't know of any deaths related to kitchen spaces, but I have found in one of the buildings in the loft space of the kitchen, large hole in the floorboard from an ash escaping from the fireplace in the loft that had burned all the way through the floorboard. So for me, that's just a reminder of, you know, how precious life is and how, you know, just accidents happen, right? You know, because it would take a while for that to burn all the way through the floor. And, you know, in the loft spaces where people sleep, you know, and so that must have happened when, you know, someone wasn't paying attention, it was unattended. And
Yeah.
so, yeah, I don't know if anyone died or anything happened, but that was the physical evidence that was left behind.
All right, Doug, are you raising your hand?
I am.
Or, okay.
I was trying to be a truce.
Okay.
No, I will. Of course, I am going to fail on remembering the name of the book, but Kelly Dietz has a whole book on African-American women in kitchens, enslaved cooks. She's currently associated with Stratford Hall Plantation there on the Northern Neck. So I'm almost betting there's probably instances of, I don't know about death, but, you know, injuries, et cetera, associated with being in a kitchen.
Okay. All right, I'm gonna do two more questions because it's 7:30. And then everything else, I can get all the questions saved after the webinar and we can answer them on our Instagram in the stories throughout next week. So Historic RVA is our Instagram handle. And if you follow us, we'll get them online somehow. But all right, this one, I think this one's an easy question. What would you call the space that Sally Hemings and others slept in next to the enslavers' bedrooms?
Hallways. I mean, what do you mean
Just is there a name? I think what they're getting at is there a name as opposed to like, you know, it's not a slave cabin, or like, just how would you describe that space? I guess just.
Well, if it's within the main house at Monticello, I mean, it could just be an attic or a garret space, or maybe just a room, a quartering room, I guess you could use that term.
But it wasn't a room because they weren't given individual rooms in the house. So they would
Right.
sleep, sometimes in the trundle beds underneath, the beds that pull out from underneath the larger
Right,
bed.
yeah.
So they'd sleep in those. So it's a trundle bed. Sometimes they just had to sleep on the floor next to the bed. So it was, I mean, I don't
Right.
know if you really have a name for it because it's wherever they were put. So yeah, I mean, I guess there isn't an official name for it because they had to sleep wherever they were told to sleep.
Yeah.
And it wasn't always the same spot. Sometimes it was in the hallway, sometimes it was next to the bed, sometimes it was in a trundle bed underneath that was pulled out underneath, it could be in a closet. I mean, it's
Right.
wherever they were told to sleep in the main house. But also technically the main house was a slave house. Enslaved people were living there.
Right.
So
So,
All right.
Daniel,
Yeah, Elva.
Daniel, can I add a little nugget to what you mentioned about the Hardgrove House in
Yeah.
John Jasper? John Jasper lived with the Hardgroves at least twice, according to the earliest biography. And Samuel, I believe his brother was Thomas Hardgrove. They had over 100 enslaved people at their big tobacco factory. And he actually worked in the house and in the gardens and that type of thing. But I can tell you that he stayed there the second time for 14 years. And maybe a couple of years earlier, so we can continue to expand the narratives about what we know based on additional information like that.
Okay, thank you. All right, I've got one last question. In the 1990s, historians had very deliberate discussions about the use of the term slaves versus enslaved. You favor slave as in slave quarters as opposed to quarters for the enslaved. Why?
Well, I'll take a stab at that. When it comes to referring to families, men, women, and children as slaves, I try to consciously use the term enslaved versus calling people, referencing people by what was done to them. So I try to make a conscious effort there. However, it can get a little wordy when it comes to places, and I would hope that people will, provide people with that gray space because it can become cumbersome. But when it comes to men, women, and children, I try to use the term enslaved instead of what was done to them. But I'll defer back to you all for the where they lived.
yeah, I would agree. Yeah, I mean, I put a ton of thought into every word I use, and because I know how much words matter. But yeah, when it comes to talking about the people, they were enslaved people. The structure itself, like it, and I say, slave house, and to be, like I said, so you don't get so wordy and descriptive, and it's, it's more, well, when keeping with the time, the period of what was taking place. And so I'm more comfortable calling it a slave house. But when I'm talking about the people themselves, I never refer to them as slaves.
Yeah, I completely agree.
Yeah.
Okay, so thank you very much. In closing, I just want to note that I got a few comments saying that the name of the book is Bound to the Fire.
Right.
And I also had a number of comments throughout this evening. Well, there were tons of questions, and a lot of people said they just wish that this was even more interactive. And I'm really looking forward to hopefully getting back to in-person lectures where afterwards we could all sit around and talk, and people could come have one-on-one conversations with our panelists as well. And I know that if we were in person tonight, you would all be getting a really big round of applause. So thank you so much. And we will we will keep talking about this, and we'll talk about it online, and hopefully I think we have a lot of sites that I can send around to go survey after this. So thank you so much for your time and for wonderful presentations. And I'm getting thank yous in the comments right now. So,
Thank you.
all right.
Great.
Thank you.
Have a great evening.
Good night.
You
Good
too.
night.
Thank you. Bye.
Bye.